Shamsuddin Yusuf had to take his leave of us. Shamsuddin, of course, was in our Abuja studios as program manager of the Center for Democracy and Development. He has since been replaced by Cynthia Mbamalu of Yaga Africa, who is there in our Abuja studios. I don't know if we can see Cynthia. But, of course, here in Lagos, we still have with us Norua Dokolo and Julius Akpong, who have been with us through this.
Yeah, I must say thank you for your patience.
For your patience. Thank you indeed. What did you make of?
Kano is obviously looking more interesting, you know, as it's like the more you see, the less you see. Evidently, some people are upset. You know, with politicians, you never can really tell. So it's difficult for me to, I mean, I feel some sympathy for the guys who were saying there were no elections, you know, there was violence. Yeah. Somebody actually said that the last time they mutilated the result sheets, this time around, they mutilated people. All right, now, so I think that, and we all know what Kano is like. So I really would hope that they can resolve Kano peacefully and let the winner, whoever the winner is, be so declared and let there be peace in Kano.
How about you, Julius?
He said something about mutilating people. Like I told you earlier on, my constituency is people. And
you don't like to hear that?
I don't like to hear that. I don't like to hear that you're seeking opportunities to take care of people and they are mutilated in the process. What it says is that they are not the focus. There are ulterior motives. Because if our interest is so much poverty alleviation, if our interest is so much infrastructure for the people, if our interest is so much, you know, better living for everybody, the process by which we get that across to them shouldn't kill them.
Well, you know, another thing that came through during the announcements, I mean, he kept...
It's not even... The announcement is just the end of the main thing. The main thing is getting the votes into the ballot boxes from the people, giving them a platform to make their decisions without them being beaten or injured by dogs or security operatives and people like that. I think we need to have a rethink as a people, because we can't keep talking about taking care of people. We can't keep talking about... I mean, the major drive for an election is to appoint one of us to give us a direction. Now, if the person in the process of coming out to give us a direction leaves the rest of us amputated and all of that, then we're not moving. There's no movement.
Well, that's
I remember you introducing...
Yes, I talked about Cynthia Mbamalu and the fact that Shamsuddin Yusuf had left, and we thanked him for coming, and that he'd since been replaced by Cynthia. Well, finally, we have Cynthia here.
Can I ask her a question, though?
Please go ahead.
Yes, Cynthia, I don't know whether you've been following the collation in Kano and, you know, and the process and how that has all played out. Just tell us first your thoughts about that, and then you can also talk about your thoughts about the whole process generally.
Yeah, I think Kano is an interesting state, and we can see that from the coalition process. One worrisome trend from Kano is the desperation on the part of political parties. Well, you can see that Kano is beyond just the governorship election. It looks like this is a play towards 2023, and that is why you see most of our critical incidents reports on the governor's supplementary elections actually came in from Kano. You wouldn't blame parties who feel aggrieved because there's something about elections. It's supposed to be competitive in such a way that different political parties have an equal opportunity to contest and compete in a process that guarantees that, yes, their votes would actually count. And when that becomes questionable, what you have to look down to is, okay, so to what extent were the infractions, and then what are the legal provisions or within which legal framework would you be making decisions on the elections? And from the collation process, already what you can see is you'd look at one, where did they have disruptions of the process? What levels of polling unit levels, where did you have cancellation of reports? what role did the security play in the elections, and then also the very critical point of voter suppression and intimidation. Because if you look at the elections in Kano, these were most of the cases we had seen, intimidation and harassment of voters. Even observers, because we watching the vote observers at some polling units were asked, were chased away from the polling units and to observe the process. At some point, their materials were destroyed and they were asked not to return to observe the process. So beyond just voter suppression was also intimidation of observers and some media practitioners on the elections, the process, and even opposition party agents in observing the process in some of the polling units. So you'd see it's becoming quite interesting. I think what is worrisome is the level of electoral impunity from these elections. One, with all this infraction, I'm hoping to see the Commission take a stand on prosecution of electoral offenders post this election, because people should be held accountable for their actions. Citizens that were victims of violence or disruption of the process, they need justice. And this is what we need to see post these elections, because the more we condone these characters or these actions, the more parties think it's easy to get away with anything. Now, we've seen already that supplementary elections are already becoming even more dangerous than the elections itself, because what you have is, with a limited area of focus, parties then mobilize the monies, they mobilize thugs to deploy violence the best way that they can, because this time around they're just concentrating on a very limited area. And what that does is it puts a lot of tension on the process. It subjects the process to a lot of violence, and you have citizens who even out of fear will not even turn out to vote. You see some of the videos from Kano State, and
something to do. If I could just ask you something to do with the report that Yaga has released, the 2019 report for this particular election. I know Lad is going to talk about that a bit more, but we've released that report, and it's quite comprehensive, I should say. But would you like to see a change in the law? Even when you watch the Kano process playing out, some people have grievances and they're told at this stage you cannot bring them up, go to the tribunal. Would you like to see a change in that, particularly when people are saying there was no voting, in the area that they're complaining about?
Oh, yes, there are lots of questions for electoral reform post these elections. Now, one is the whole legal regime on cancellation of votes at polling units, because parties are now manipulating that process to favor them or to disfavor a particular side. So one, cancellation of ballots. So where there is intentional disruption of the process, so in regions of your opponent's stronghold, so that those elections at those polling units are cancelled. So it means that you already have people who already plan to disrupt processes in the opposition stronghold. So that is one. The other is also the whole regime on voter suppression, or where the process is not adhered to, like where there's non-deployment of the smart card readers, and then calls for cancellation for those polling units. And then you also have the whole conversation on what happens where voting did not take place. And what do you do? Because you have voters whose rights have been violated. They've gone out to vote, and then voting did not take place. And then you have results. We had one of the polling units, we actually identified there was no voting, and then there was the results at the collation center in that polling unit in Kano State. So there is a lot that we need to do. One, the legal regime on cancellation of ballots, we need to revisit that, because it has become a very lucrative sector for political parties to manipulate the process and to start calling for more supplementary elections. And so that is one of the things we need to look at in post-2019. Then the law itself on the overvoting regime. So if you look at one of the amendments, the Electoral Act that wasn't signed in 2018, was the fact to expand to ensure that when voting or where voting takes place and the total number of votes cast is more than accredited voters, that such polling units, the votes will be cancelled. Now, that is only what we have in the manual and the guidelines. It's not in the Electoral Act. But we need to actually expand the whole conversation on the margin of lead principle within the Electoral Act in such a way that it becomes difficult to manipulate that. Then also where you have polling officials who, at their own discretion, decide to breach the legal guidelines for electoral conduct of elections. We also need to look at that, because what you had in some polling units on elections day one, we had a polling unit where the voting copico was not present. People were voting and party agents were trying to cross-check who voters voted for. So you see already the secrecy of the ballots already was already violated in those kinds of polling units. So
I need to cut in. I want to cut in. Cynthia, I want to cut in. I want to cut in and ask you this. I have in my hand here your preliminary, the preliminary statement on the counting, collation, and results of the elections yesterday. You issued this at 2 p.m. today. And amongst, I mean, we're in Kano now. Our focus is on Kano, where we're expecting the final results announcements. And you said there are two things that your statement says that are highly interesting. You said that Yaga is questioning the credibility of some results announced by INEC in polling units and LGA collation centers where observers and voters were chased away by political thugs and police officers. I'm particularly interested in the part of the police officers, and you mentioned the names of some of these units in Kano. Then, of course, you referred to one particular polling unit there. Here, it is 003 Alcala in Gaya Arewa Ward in Gaya local government, where voting was not concluded at the polling unit, but results were announced at the collation center. Now, in these two instances that your report highlights, is that just the end of it? Your report will highlight it, and that will be the end? Is business as usual, life goes on?
Well, for us as observer groups, our role is to expose where you have challenges in the process. And that is why we're very critical to identify those polling units and that result. You look at the polling units we had mentioned, what happened was at the point of voting, at some point, some police officers or alleged police, because they were putting on the uniform, they came in and they moved to the materials and the personnel, and then the voters were still on the queue. Then we asked our observer to go to the collation center and specifically watch out for that polling unit to be sure results were not announced. And subsequently, the observer reported that that polling unit where the voting was not concluded, the results were announced. We also mentioned some local governments where observers were not allowed, like Boko, Tupo, and Otupo, I can't pronounce that, the third in Benue State, where observers were not granted access. Now, for us as observer groups, what we have, our role is to provide information to citizens to use. Now, we're glad political parties also have a right to challenge elections in court. So they can take these, they can take the result, the report, and then challenge the matter in court. Remember that based on the sections, from sections 133 of the Electoral Act, only parties who contest an election can actually challenge the outcome of the elections in court. So as observer groups, we can't challenge the outcome of the elections in court. Our role is to provide information, and interested parties who have a stake in the process can use those information to either challenge or question the outcome of the result. For us, wherever we have doubt, we have to state that clearly. If we were not granted access to observe that, then we can't talk about the credibility of the result in those places. And then if there are polling units where elections did not hold, and we subsequently got reports that results are announced from those polling units, we have a duty to actually expose those polling units, because citizens need to know. Parties who contested also need to know. So that is our role, and we are hoping that parties actually look at observer reports from different groups who deployed observers for the supplementary elections, and that on the basis of those verifiable and credible reports, either state a claim over the credibility or challenge the credibility of the process. So that is for parties to, that is the role of parties in the elections.